G'day guys, I hope you've all had a safe and productive weekend. I myself certainly have. I've been doing a lot of work in the garden, but we're not going to be chatting about that today. We're going to be chatting about coronavirus, specifically coronavirus in Iceland, because they've made an interesting discovery with their testing over there. Now, Iceland is pretty interesting in terms of coronavirus because they have the highest per capita testing rate in the entire world. And why this exactly may be, I'm not too sure. Perhaps it's because all the population is sort of clustered in several urban centers rather than spread out across, say, the United States or something like that. But they have found something very interesting, which I'll read for you right now. So Iceland's randomized tests have revealed that between 0.3 to 0.8 of Iceland's population is infected with a respiratory illness. This is data from about a week ago. And that 50% of those who tested positive to the virus are asymptomatic when they are tested. Now, the article goes on to chat about how those who are least at risk, their level of infection has dropped, and that's a good thing because they've been doing some social distancing and lockdowns and this sort of thing, as is the rest of the world. Now, that's a really interesting thing to report, that 50% of cases are asymptomatic. Now, what this appears to indicate, and the article doesn't go on to espouse this, but again, I'll add a little spitball amateur analysis here, and this is my own analysis. It is possible that an asymptomatic mutant of this coronavirus has arisen and has run around infecting the population. So it's just as virulent as the COVID that everyone's worrying about. But since it's asymptomatic, or perhaps it has symptoms that are so mild, mild cough and this sort of thing, and for the average person that's not anything of concern, you're not going to go get tested if you're asymptomatic, and you're not going to go tested if you have a bit of a sore throat and this sort of thing, because if you're a fit and healthy, especially young individual, that's not going to trouble you so much. So it's entirely possible that there is a asymptomatic version of coronavirus in Iceland, as well as other parts of the world, because obviously Europe is highly connected, and from there on you can get to the rest of the world. Now, when we look at this testing here, it does bear well to keep a few things in mind. Iceland is obviously Iceland. It's not Germany, it's not Spain, it's not Africa, it's not Australia, it's not America. Iceland has a certain demographic setup. Iceland has a certain genetic makeup, and whether these tests will bear any relevance for the rest of the world, well, I'm not sure you can exactly claim that. Obviously, you need to do your own testing to find out and this sort of thing. And at time of writing, Iceland said they were unsure whether these cases they were having, these asymptomatic cases, were going to end up developing symptoms. But what we found about a week after they started doing this, if we have a look at their daily new cases in Iceland, and again, we're assuming they're still testing at the same vigorous rate. So this article was written on April the 10th, and we can see since then the number of daily new cases has dropped since then. So these people, given a week to start showing symptoms, have not begun to show symptoms. Again, this seems to reinforce the idea to me that there's an asymptomatic mutant running around in Iceland, and if it's running around in Iceland, it's probably in mainland Europe, because obviously Iceland being an island, about 30% of their cases originated from overseas travel and this sort of thing. Now, this is actually really good news, because obviously this means that a novel coronavirus, people are going to develop an immunity, or at least a resistance to this, because if they've already been infected once, the body sort of knows how to fight it off. And it'd be interesting to think about perhaps this invisible coronavirus may have actually entered the rest of the world before the novel coronavirus that everyone's worried about. And since it just wasn't tested for, but it still appears to be so virulent since so many people are infected, it'd be interesting if that sort of actually spread ahead of the initial coronavirus and was providing a herd immunity and this sort of thing. This idea that viruses get less worse over time, less deadly to their hosts, is backed up by natural selection, because if you think about two viruses, and one is so deadly that it kills its host, and one is less deadly or even asymptomatic, the one that is asymptomatic has more opportunity to incubate and spread and propagate, because obviously viruses need live cells to reproduce. They can't reproduce in a dead body. So the virus that runs around and kills its host quickly or eventually isn't able to reproduce as much as the virus that's asymptomatic or very mildly symptomatic, just a mild sort of infection in general. It's more able to spread its genetics throughout the population and this sort of thing. So I believe that natural selection backs up the idea that a virus would get less deadly over time, which may be what we're seeing here in real time. Certainly very interesting. Now, I'm not going to do a mainstream media and sort of lurch from one extreme to another. They sort of went, at least in Australia, well, they never even reported about it, and then suddenly it was a big problem, and then, oh, why are people panicking? And, you know, oh, people are so ridiculous for panicking, and now it's solved, and then it's not, and they're just lurching back and forth because they need to make money, obviously, because they peddle fear, they peddle hysteria, and this sort of thing. An interesting perspective I saw on the mainstream media, just a little aside, is, you know, you could do honest and straight reporting, but you're always going to hear about the story wherein a porn star was shot dead during a hurricane. So obviously that's sort of novel and exciting stuff and things like that. So rather than doing something like that and saying, you know, hallelujah, we're saved because, you know, herd immunity, invisible coronavirus and this sort of thing, all I'm going to say is this is promising. Because again, something to keep in mind is that Iceland is Iceland. It has a specific genetic makeup, it has a specific demographic, a specific population size, density, all these unique little factors that may play into what we're seeing here. Let's think of the general health of Iceland, because obviously people who are unhealthy, when you get a new infection, you're more likely to show symptoms because your immune system's weakened, if you have obesity, heart problems, organ problems, and this sort of thing. So we think about another country, say, thinking stereotypically, America, but also Australia. Australia also has very high rates of obesity. You know, this may be not reflected within those nations because people are obese, people are less healthy, and then they're showing more symptoms and this sort of thing. So I'm not going to go ahead and proclaim, as the mainstream media may do, if they bother to report on this, that, you know, hallelujah, things are saved. All I'm going to say is this is promising for the outcome of the disease if there is an asymptomatic version running around. And again, we don't even know. It's just, you know, things that I'm interpreting from this data in my own amateur perspective. It is promising if there's an asymptomatic mutant that has arisen and has run around infecting people, because it means things can open back up. Obviously, the more things that open back up, the more we can spread around this asymptomatic variant of this disease and give people this immunity, or at least resistance, because reinfection is possible with coronavirus. And as we're seeing, I don't think this is just, you know, the incubation period that I've talked about a lot in my coronavirus videos. Obviously, coronavirus on average incubates asymptomatically, but still you're still infectious. You can infect other people for an average 2 weeks, but it can be up to a month. Because if that was the case for this, we would expect to see the number of cases in Iceland begin to skyrocket because they've tested so many people. 50% of them are asymptomatic. Well, I've waited a week to report on this. We should expect to see those numbers skyrocket, but they haven't. The daily number of new cases is decreasing, as we've seen. So that seems to indicate that this is truly an asymptomatic version of the disease. Again, at least in my own amateur opinion. So it is promising news. I'm not promising salvation. I'm also not promising doomsday. I'm not lurching between the two in order to capitalize and make money and get views and all this sort of cringy thing. So yeah, it's just interesting information to keep in mind. As usual, make sure you get your sunlight for your vitamin D, eat your onions, eat your garlic, get your vitamin C into you too, lemons and this sort of thing, oranges. Make sure you keep exercising. A big lesson in general is that people are going to wish they'd been healthy before this rolled around. So yeah, good on you if you're exercising. And if you're not, time to start. The floor is always free. You don't need a gym to exercise. I know this. I've been doing lots of home workouts, the deck of pain and this sort of thing. So have fun and take care.